Good afternoon. My name is Heather Murphy. I am a medical project director at the National Kidney Foundation, and I am leading our xenotransplantation initiatives. Welcome to our highly anticipated webinar on xenotransplantation, where we will provide updates on animal to human transplants. We are thrilled to have over 860 of you joining us today, demonstrating the immense interest in and importance of this groundbreaking innovation. As a leader in the xenotransplantation space, the National Kidney Foundation aims to support the exploration of kidney xenotransplantation as a potential treatment for end-stage kidney disease. The NKF's goal is to ensure the patient voice is heard and integrated into the fabric of kidney xenotransplantation. Our initiatives are part of a coordinated effort involving government agencies, xenotransplantation companies, researchers, the community, and most importantly, the patients. Today's webinar is a continuation of our previous meetings on kidney xenotransplantation. Our goal today is to provide you, the community, with an unbiased update on the recent developments in the xenotransplantation space and give you a chance to ask questions to our experts. Now let me introduce our distinguished webinar chairs. Dr. Tatsuo Kawai. Dr. Kawai is a professor of surgery at Harvard Medical School and the A. Benedict Cassimi Chair in Transplant Surgery at Massachusetts General Hospital. He is also director of the Legorreta Center for Clinical Transplantation Tolerance. His clinical and research interests are focused primarily on development of methods to induce immunological tolerance in organ transplantation. Next, we have Dr. Vinita Kumar. Dr. Kumar is a transplant nephrologist and director of the high-risk transplant program and is involved in the xenotransplantation efforts at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. She is an expert in kidney transplantation, living kidney donation, incompatible kidney transplant, kidney pair donation, and cardiovascular outcomes after kidney transplantation. And finally, we have Dr. Peter Reese. Dr. Reese is an NIH-funded transplant nephrologist, epidemiologist, and ethicist at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. Some of his research includes developing effective strategies to increase access in kidney transplantation, improving the process of selecting and caring for live kidney donors, just to name a few. These experts will share insights and updates that underscore the collaborative spirit driving xenotransplantation forward. You will have the opportunity to ask questions to our three experts today. Your participation is a vital part of this ongoing conversation, and we are excited to have you with us as we explore the future of this experimental procedure. Before we dive into the meat of the webinar, there are just a few items that I wanted to touch on. There were many questions submitted through the registration form, and we are so grateful for this. We will start with answering some of the most frequently asked questions to set the stage for today's webinar. Throughout the webinar, we encourage you to submit your questions via the question and answer section of Zoom. You will find this along the bottom of your Zoom application, and it is a Q&A. Our team will be actively monitoring this section and will answer as many questions as we can during this webinar. Please note that the experts are here to give you information and updates about xenotransplantation. They will not be giving any medical advice. And finally, the webinar is being recorded and will be made publicly available after the event. Thank you for being here and for your continued support and engagement. Together, we are making strides towards a future where innovations like xenotransplantation could save the lives of many. So let's begin. As I mentioned, we will begin with some of the more frequently asked questions. So we will start with Dr. Kumar. We'll kick it off with a few overview questions. So a common question that we received was asking for a general overview. What is xenotransplantation?
Sure, Heather. Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. And so kicking us off with the basic question, what is xenotransplantation? So very simplistically, when you transfer organs or tissues or cells between two different species, that's xenotransplantation. So the two species we're referring to are animal to human. If you think about what happens in current day transplantation, a human to human transplant, we call that allotransplantation. So when a friend gives to a friend, or a husband gives to a wife, or a parent gives to a child, human to human, that's allotransplantation. So when it's animal to human, it's called xenotransplantation. And for the purposes of our time together, actively what's being looked at is pig as the source animal. And scientifically, you could hear the word porcine. So porcine, pig. So it's pig to human transplantation. So pig to human xenotransplantation. And the pigs in question are the genetically modified pigs to human xenotransplantation. And I know Dr. Kawai will go into more detail about that later. But Heather, that sort of kicks us off with the basic question.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. And one more question for you. Why is it important? What are the benefits of pursuing this research with xenotransplantation?
Absolutely. Why are we spending this hour talking about it, or all the time the scientists have spent over decades working in xenotransplantation space? Why is that? So let's sort of think about 2023. This was the year past. This is the year we did the most number of transplantations, most number of kidney transplantations, 31,000 kidney transplantations. However, we had 3 times as many people waiting for a transplant this past year. And the real sort of fact that sort of is very sobering for all of us is that almost 9,000 patients every day are either removed or die while waiting for a kidney transplant. That's 25 patients a day. And so clearly, while we are doing well and we've had the most successful year in transplantation, we're still not fully meeting the need. We need more. We need more organs. We need more deceased and living donor organs. And this is not just kidneys for deceased donors, it's other organ types. But where are those extra organs to fill the need? And therefore, we are now looking at alternative sources to meet the need. And the alternative sources could be artificial kidneys and xenotransplantation. And as we'll talk more, xenotransplantation has made a lot of strides in the recent times. So this is why we're all gathered together to talk about why this is so important.
Thank you, Dr. Kumar. Now, moving on to Dr. Kawai, I have some questions for you. So first, how does xenotransplantation differ from allotransplantation?
Okay. Hi, everybody. Nice seeing you today. So difference between human transplant and the xenotransplant. So in a human transplant, even if we don't give you any immunosuppression, you will not reject the human kidney for about 5 to 6 days, then start to reject the kidney if no immunosuppression is given. However, if you transplant pig, why do the type pig into a human monkey? In this case monkey, but immediately after reperfusion is fine, looks great. However, in 10 minutes, you will completely reject pig kidneys. So why the rejection is so rapid and strong in xenotransplantation? Because we have a natural antibody in our body. So our natural antibodies circulate in your blood after transplant of pig organs. Those are immediately binds to xenoantigens. There's major three kind of xenoantigens, but it's expressed on the pig cells. Then our antibodies immediately bind those xenoantigens on the pig cells, then destroy pig cells or organs, reject. That is why the immediate rejection can be seen in xenotransplantation. So to address this kind of hyperacute rejection by genetic modification, we can delete those xenoantigens and insert multiple human genes to protect the pig cells from the rejection. With this kind of genetically modified pig kidneys, if we transplant into monkeys, and the best results, about 50% of the monkeys survived over 1 year, and longest survival 2 to 3 years has been reported. But remember, those gene edition was made for humans. It's not for monkeys. Inserted the genes of humans. So the monkey results is supposed to be less than human results. If we transplant those gene-edited pig kidney into the humans, results supposed to be a bit better than this. So how about human studies? Some groups transplanted those genetically converted, modified pig kidney into the brain-dead individual. They cannot keep these individuals so long. The observation time is limited from the couple of days to 2 months. The longest one is 2 months. But they use different kind of gene edition. So I previously said there's 3 major xenoantigens. So all 3 is deleted. We can call it triple knockout. If it's one of them is only removed, it says 1 knockout. So those 3 knockout, 1 knockout without human transgenes are tested. And we are getting very important insight from those the experiments. Now, more recently, those genetically modified pigs is transplanted into living humans. At MGH, we used triple knockout and with 7 human transgenes. And the patient survived for 52 days. Unfortunately, he passed away. He had a severe coronary artery disease from the beginning, and he passed away due to those heart disease. Unfortunately, it's very unexpected, and we all saddened his loss. But the kidney was fine until the end. The oral pathology showed no rejection and no other abnormalities. In NYU patient was also very sick patient with assisted heart device. They transplanted 1 knockout pig kidney without human transgenes, and unfortunately, after 47 days, kidney was taken out. But we, gained lots of information from those precious experiences. So this is a kidney right after transplantation showing very beautiful kidneys. And this kidney immediately started to make urine.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Twai, for that update on the research and where we are now. And so I'll turn it over then to Dr. Rees. Dr. Rees, one question that we received many times through that registration form is, when will this be available for the kidney community? Can you speak to that?
Sure. So, the big picture where it stands right now is that the transplants that Tatsuo just described are either being performed in a brain-dead human body, or they've been performed under what you could think of as compassionate use. So compassionate use is a setting where it's not a clinical trial and is not standard of care. What you have is you have a therapy that's not approved by the Food and Drug Administration for standard of care treatments. And a medical center might come to the Food and Drug Administration and say, we have a patient who's really in a bad situation. They have no other options. And so they're willing and we're willing to use this therapy that hasn't gone through an approval process. And that's essentially how these transplants took place at NYU, at Mass General, and then heart transplants that took place at the University of Maryland. And so for this to, if we think about all the steps that would be necessary for any of us to be able to talk to our patients in clinic about it, I think the first thing that would happen is that it would go into clinical trials. And in clinical trials, instead of being compassionate use, where you have a patient who's sort of saying, I have no other options, they'll have criteria and they'll screen patients, who are acceptable for those criteria. They'll carry on the trial, realistically probably take years for it to be completed and published. And once that information is accumulated that it seems like it's effective and safe, then you can try to get the Food and Drug Administration to approve it. Then if we think beyond that, I think there's another issue that I don't think anyone really knows yet, which is what the process would be to scale this technology up. So, there's some drugs that are made, might be an antibiotic that's like a pill, that there might be many different factories that could make it. And you might even have competition between countries. Maybe the United States is moving slowly, but factory in India can make it, much, much faster. With xenotransplant, you have a different situation, which is that you've got to grow these. You could think about it as cloning, and then growing these pigs up on farms that are pathogen-free facilities. So the number of steps, I think, to sort of create the facilities, to create the pigs, and to scale it up, it may be a little bit slower than some other technologies that we've dealt with, other medicines that we're used to prescribing. So my sense is that we're going to see, hopefully, knock on wood, in the relatively near future, clinical trials, which will be small. But the road to bringing this to all the patients who could potentially benefit from it is probably going to be a long road. And I don't think I have a good crystal ball to kind of know how fast we'll get through all those steps. I hope, Heather, does that seem like that addresses the question?
Absolutely, thank you. And it actually perfectly leads into the next question that I have for you, which we received many questions about the clinical trial process. What do you anticipate the process being like, and what are the barriers to the clinical trials? What challenges that you foresee happening?
Well, I think first of all, we have to hope that one of the small number of companies that are able to, offer these genetically engineered organs will be able to stay in business and be able to be persistent enough to convince the FDA to approve a trial. Tatsuo or Vanita may have, more up-to-date information than I have, but in my conversations with people, at the FDA and others, I get the sense that when they approve a trial, they'll probably say something like, well, at a small number of centers, you'll be allowed to do maybe, one transplant or two transplants, and then we're going to watch and see how those recipients do for a while. So I think the trials will probably be fairly slow, with a lot of very close monitoring of the patients to make sure that things go okay before they authorize additional transplants. So just to give you a sense of why this is different than a lot of things we see, I'll just give you a different example. When we were in COVID, we remember that, they were doing trials of vaccines, or, you might think of a trial of like a new diabetes drug. In a situation like that, you might have a big company that enrolls like thousands of people over a year. So you get data pretty much more quickly. Here we're talking about like really small numbers, probably at a small number of centers. And that might go on for a while. And then I think the last piece is that of a big question that we don't really know how the FDA is going to think about it is who's allowed in the trial. And we all have opinions about this. I think I can say that I've definitely met patients who I would say, maybe like the patient who was transplanted under compassionate use in Mass General is a reasonable candidate for the trial, but there's going to be a lot of scientific debate about the age of the patient, how robust the patient is, what other options do they have. I think a patient who does this also is probably going to need to be pretty psychologically robust. They're going to have to, this is going to be a situation where you transplant a patient, but their whole family is on a journey. So there's going to be a lot of considerations for who moves forward. So that's how I'm kind of thinking about the road to these trials. there's a meeting of science, ethics, and regulation in a pretty intense way.
Thank you, Dr. Reese. That was very clear in that we have a lot to still learn about this. And Dr. Kawai, Dr. Kumar, did you have anything you would want to add about that?
I agree with Peter. As far as doing this kind of transplant as a compassionate use, the patient is naturally very sick, and difficult transplant in the sick patient is not the right way. So sometimes I think we are confident now. We can handle rejection and suppress rejection for 2 months completely. And together with experience in monkeys, we are now very confident to take care of those transplants. However, we need to have a right patient, but we disclose our results we experienced from the human study completely. Then we discuss with FDA, and I think hopefully they allow us to do a clinical trial.
Heather, I was just going to add that Dr. Reese covered this really well. This is not prime time ready, as in 6 months from now or a year from now, we're going to be using these organs for all our patients on the wait list. While that's our ultimate goal, this is definitely a process that needs to be done carefully, slowly, over years before we get to that point of offering it to our public. So the next emphasis of focus will be clinical trials, and that's a more realistic question to ask is, what could the timeline for clinical trials look like? That'll require the medical community and the FDA and our patient groups and organizations to all work together to move that needle. As of now, there's conversations, but there's nothing that I know of, or I'm sure Dr. Kawai's nodding and Dr. Reese just said, where any clinical trial has been announced as of yet.
Thank you. Thank you. And so those were kind of, the most frequently asked questions that we received leading into this webinar. But now please feel free to use the question and answer box at the bottom of your application. At this point, the experts are here and ready to answer some questions. So we have received a few so far. Have studies like this been done on liver or heart transplants?
Well, we know that there's been heart transplants, also compassionate use at the University of Maryland, at the University of Pennsylvania, where I am, and I know that there's been work on this at Mass General as well. We've been doing experiments on brain dead research donors studies, where instead of transplanting the liver, we put the liver in like a dialysis machine. And the idea is that that could support a patient who had, a very sick liver temporarily. There has been a report from China, I believe, about a xenotransplant in a liver patient. The full details of it, I think, are not, really available yet. How that patient, I think, was about 70, how that patient did.
Thank you. What are the realistic and unrealistic risks of xenotransplantation?
Dr. Reese, you want to get us started, and maybe Dr. Kawai and I can jump in with that?
Go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I think that realistically speaking, I think it may be multiple years before this is something that we're offering to our patients outside of a clinical trial. If I had to guess, the clinical trials will have some successful results and probably some challenges. We are worried about rejection. I think that we're also hopeful that these companies will be able to, procure these organs and bring them to us in a sterile way, and that we don't have to worry about any transmission of infections from pigs. I think the burdens on families are going to be heavy. And so we're going to have to learn a lot about how to support the patients and the families through this. And then I guess the only thing that I would say is that we have to be very careful not to draw too many conclusions when the numbers are so small. Just as Tatsuo said, the patient at Mass General may have died of things that had nothing to do with the pig kidney transplant. We just don't know when the numbers are so small. So I think we just have to be patient and get as much data as we can and not draw conclusions too soon.
Yeah, jumping off from that same point that Dr. Rees made, we draw parallels between the first human-to-human transplant that happened in 1954. It was decades, probably in the late 80s to early 90s, before it started to become really commonplace. In fact, the whole national allocation system and all of that started to become a conversation point somewhere in the mid 80s, once we figured out that this does work for a segment of patients. And then the broad applicability of it over the next 20 years as immunosuppression progressed happened. So it took a good 20, 30 years for us to really understand how to use even human-to-human transplant. So going back to Dr. Rees's point of having 2 hearts so far, 2 kidneys so far, and maybe 1 liver in China, it's very, very small numbers. And certain things, we know from these small numbers, at least the 2 kidneys, since we're in the kidney space, that when there was no immediate rejection, there was no immediate death. As far as we could tell, there was no immediate risk from the organ to the patient. And then once we went past that, and this is where Dr. Kawai, you can speak more, the question then becomes, we automatically start comparing risks of xeno with risks of allo. And what we're finding is that patients or individuals who will go through these transplants will require immunosuppression, a lot of immunosuppression, probably more than what we are using right now for human to human, at least in the first iterations. So all the burdens that come from immunosuppression use, we have to be aware and monitor and share and know how to mitigate those things. And there's a few other things, but Dr. Kawai, I'll turn it over to you for consideration.
Yeah. So realistic risk is obviously immunosuppression rejection, right? So how much we can control rejection. So if we can put lots of immunosuppression, it's possible, but cannot do it forever. So we have to adjust immunosuppression. So we have to find out right dose of immunosuppression for xenotransplant. So we still have to work on a lot. That is a realistic risk. I'm also, I cannot conclude anything, just small numbers, but unrealistic risk is zoonosis. So we have sent the patient blood for very sensitive assays for any porcine-derived pathogens every week, but we have never detected any concerning pathogens from the porcine derived. So I hope zoonosis is not realistic risk, but we still have to be carefully, slowly making progress with patient care.
Thank you, the 3 of you. So we've received a few questions on how people can help move clinical trials along. What can we as living donors and kidney recipients do to help advance clinical trials? How can we help move this process forward at a faster pace? Is there advocacy or donations, or what can people do in the community?
I think, patient voices to the FDA is most important. So even if we ask FDA to go ahead for clinical trial, they may say that if they have a human transplant option in a couple of years to 5 years, which they should wait. So in that case, we have to find out the patient who do not have any transplant option like more than 10 years or so. So naturally, those patients is very difficult for the transplant. So whether they allow us to go ahead for more regular patient is, I think the patient voice is very important. When, I think Nikita did mention, very interesting things, about the beginning of human transplant. So I'm kind of old enough to know the transplant before cyclosporine. So when I was an intern, there was no cyclosporine. And at that time, it was human transplant was still very experimental. There's only 40% kidney was accepted over 1 year. And lots of patients died due to infection or gastrointestinal bleeding. So around that time, it was dark time. But then the cyclosporine appeared, and then totally now different. So, those process is similar things. So right now, I think the situation of xenotransplant is a bit much better than that age of the human transplant.
Thank you. Just looking at the list of questions, would the FDA approve a compassionate use application if I asked for it as a patient?
So I think the way the process works is, I think a medical center, DA, the process of doing compassionate use, actually Tatsuo is in the best position to respond to this. It is actually a very complicated and heavy burden for a medical center to carry out. So I think it really has to be a partnership between a center with the resources and the preparation to do that. It would be not really feasible for a patient to initiate the process.
Right, and Dr. Kawai, you can speak more, but the EIND, which is the emergency use IND, is given to not necessarily the center, but to a provider at the center who takes responsibility for a patient. So if there's somebody who wants to be considered for this, they would probably need to approach the centers who've done it or may be doing it to express their interest. But
yeah, our patient was run out all options to continue hemodialysis because he has run out the vascular access to continue hemodialysis, and we only use a catheter, dialysis catheter, to do that, but this catheter frequently clotted, so it was very difficult. And because the reason why we cannot create vascular access for him is that he has extensive vascular disease, and severe calcification limit the artery that we can use for vascular access. So he also had a severe coronary artery disease history and have a history of myocardial infarction. So so there's no option to continue to hemodialysis at that time. So therefore, we asked the FDA and got approval to go ahead xenotransplantation. So it's very difficult to find out those kind of patients. But unfortunately, he is not sensitized. He had a previous transplant, but he is not like, if he still have a PRA is a bit too specific term, but he has some sensitization, but not highly sensitized by the previous transplant. So still okay to go to a next transplant. But if his patient is highly sensitized, it's more, I believe it's difficult to do a xenotransplantation at this point. So it's kind of it's very difficult to find out right patient if you know, as a compassionate use.
Thank you. And we are receiving quite a few questions about, how do you choose the patient? And I think you're very clear that it's a challenge. You have to find the right patient that is also willing to take this on.
Heather,
go
I
ahead.
just wanted to add one other thing, if I could jump in. When we think about transplantation or xenotransplantation in particular, the comparator is always, we have dialysis. So it's not imminent death compared to if it's liver, heart, lung transplant scenarios. And so that's what we hear even within medical communities when there's conversation about this. We are looking for patients that have, quote, no other options. So then they turn to xenotransplantation. And yet there's another segment of our patient community that tells us, even if they're on dialysis, dialysis is tough, dialysis is hard, that they would be willing, even knowing the unknowns and the risks, they may be willing to consider xenotransplantation. That's where I think also the patient voice, the community voice, the recipients, the living donors, their voices matter, because hearing from providers who say that is so very different from a patient who says that. And I think that's another consideration here. And I think I learned to think that way from you, Dr. Rees, when we had first started having conversations about our externally led patient-focused drug development. But I just wanted to bring that up as a very powerful space for patient voices. But I'd love to hear how your thinking's evolved since then, Dr. Rees.
Well, if I'm understanding the question, I mean, I think both for compassionate use and for clinical trials, I think the ethical principle is going to be something along the lines of, this is a patient whose other options are really bad. It doesn't have to be a patient on their deathbed, but it could be a patient kind of like Mr. Sleeman, who is hopefully robust enough that people think they can survive xenotransplant, but they're in a very bad situation in terms of their other options. Now, being in a bad situation could mean different things. Could be that you're out of vascular access. I think it could also mean a patient who, despite counseling, despite palliative care, despite treatment of depression, is really at the end of their rope and very demoralized by dialysis, maybe unwilling to do it further. That would be another way to think of a patient who's a reasonable choice for a clinical trial or for compassionate use. So I guess what I'm sort of saying is we're sort of threading a needle between a person who's healthy enough to deal with this challenge, not just surgery, not just immunosuppression, but more immunosuppression than they might otherwise get with a kidney transplant or different. And on the other hand, their other options are really bad. So here are some types of patients who I think should not be chosen for xenotransplant. They have a living donor. Don't do xenotransplant. They have enough wait list priority that it's likely they'll get a deceased donor transplant if they wait a little while longer. They feel like they're doing relatively well on dialysis. They feel like they're able to manage the burdens of dialysis. I think those are not the right people. And then I think there's probably another piece of this, which is that someone who engages in this is going to need to go through a lot of psychosocial evaluation so that we understand that their expectations are realistic. If a patient says, I know for me it's going to go great, that's not the right person to get a xenotransplant. I think you need someone who's going to say, no one knows. You've told me, and I believe no one knows how this is going to go. And there's going to be a lot of potentially surprises ahead, but I'm resilient and I'm ready to take those on.
One thing that you have to mention is that the human kidney is not always perfect.
Very true.
Lots of deceased donor kidney is very marginal, but we still transplanting those. And occasionally the patient cannot come off dialysis. Kidney function doesn't recover enough. So even the human transplant sometimes is not just perfect. So if we start clinical trial of xenotransplant, and if we can show like 5 year survival for like 60 or 70% of the patients, then the xenotransplant will replace human transplant. But this is just beginning, so it's very difficult to prove whether we can do it or not. So that's very important period right now.
Thank you. And we've received some questions with the complications in the scientific process. Why are you choosing patients that have comorbid conditions that are already in end stage kidney failure? Why wouldn't you choose somebody more healthy?
So when we have had internal discussions about who we think would be a good, or not good, but who could or should be a candidate, after robust discussions, we've decided that if we pick a candidate for clinical trials, they have to be a candidate for allotransplantation, as in they have to be eligible for human-to-human transplant and just not able to get it. That's, I think, the robustness Dr. Reese may be referring to, because even allotransplantation is not straightforward for some of our patients. So the question being asked about why can't we consider robust patients is an absolutely appropriate question. Patients need to be robust to a degree to be able to withstand surgery, the higher immunosuppression, and then also withstand both emotionally and psychologically what we will demand of them. A lot more monitoring, a lot more hospital stay, a lot more frequent clinic visits. Dr. Reese alluded to this, but there's going to be loss of privacy for both the patients and their family members. So all of this takes a degree of robustness, both physical and mental and emotional, that our patients will need. So if you ask me for my opinion, I completely agree that patients who understand risks, and understanding risk meaning really not knowing what the risks are, we can enumerate a big list and say, this is what we know based on the handful of patient and antecedent experiences we have. But we'll walk this walk with you, and patients being able to reflect that back. I think that becomes a very important part of this, along with healthier patients and not patients on that store. But Dr. Kawai, you're nodding along, so I'd let you.
I noticed, Heather, that there were a number of comments about health equity. That might be a good topic. So, I think it's a really good time to think about health equity, and maybe when we advocate to the FDA for xenotransplant to go forward, that should be part of our advocacy. It's hard in the compassionate use setting to measure equity because the numbers are really small, and we're choosing patients with who meet really narrow criteria. But I think it's really important to be worried about equity, and some steps that we can take now are things like making the selection criteria really transparent, trying to engage with patients just as we are now, like at different levels. So at my transplant center, University of Pennsylvania, we should have, if we're going to engage in xenotransplant, maybe a patient advisory board to get the perspective of patients when we design consent forms, when we talk to the media. The companies that produce these organs, eGenesis, United Therapeutics, they should have patient advisory boards. They should be listening to the patients when they design their trials. So I think that's really important. Other people have raised questions about cost. I don't think anyone knows what the cost will be, but no one will be sadder than me if this turns out to be a therapy that only the wealthy can afford. I think that's going to be a really important issue. And I think when they do design trials, I think health equity is going to be really important, making sure that the educational materials are really accessible. Maybe they should be translated into languages like Spanish. We have a lot of Spanish-speaking people in the United States. we should really give people the support they need to make it through the trial. So it's never too early to kind of try to engineer equity in the process. I think that's very important. It's just hard to know if we're doing it right when the numbers are so small right now.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Reeves. There have been some questions about the wait list and the potential effect on the allotransplant wait list if people were to sign up for xenotransplantation. Has there been any interaction with UNOS?
Yeah, we talked about, about this. So the patient can keep that acquired wait time, so they're not going to lose those time. So even if you get the xenotransplant and function a couple of years, then had to take it out, but still they keep their waiting time for the allotransplant. So they are ready to get the human kidneys by that time. That's a very important point.
Yes, so I agree. We also have a letter from UNOS that tells us that patients will not lose their place or waiting time if they come back to the list again with the failed xeno or if the xeno didn't work. The considerations, though, we need to keep in mind is once somebody undergoes a xenotransplant, how would that affect their ability to actually get a transplant? Not losing their time is important, but will the xeno organ, the immune response to that, lead to the recipient getting sensitized now, making it more challenging for them to find a compatible human organ match later? We don't know that. It could very well be that it might make it harder for them. There is also antibodies or that could be formed to the pig organ that could potentially react to human organs later. Xenotransplant candidates will get a lot of immunosuppression. And so what will that do to their body in the future when they have to get additional immunosuppression for that human-to-human transplant? And finally, transplant centers evaluate patients on their medical history, including previous transplants and presence of a xenotransplant, space for another organ, outcomes associated to that will all be taken into consideration in assessing the risks and benefits of subsequent human organ transplant. So these are all considerations. And again, this is why this needs to be done slowly, iteratively, one at a time, learning more as we go. And these are the questions that we will need to try and find appropriate answers to with time.
Thank you. Next question, what role do you see xenotransplantation playing in pediatric or young adolescent patient populations?
At this point, probably, we don't know, but at this point, probably because a younger patient can get human kidney easier than adult in older patients. That is allocation policy. So they can have a more chance of getting human transplant. So probably at this point, we are not keen to transplant xenograft to younger patients. That's my opinion.
Dr. Koh, I agree with you. Our transplant community at the present time has made the commitment to share the best kidneys, if you will, with our pediatric population. So the kidneys that we think would have the best post-transplant performance or survival, that's what is shared currently with our pediatric population and that young adolescent population. And so until xenotransplantation gets to that stage, philosophically, I kind of align with you that I find it hard to say that they will be our early patients. Dr. Reese, how do you feel about that? I'd love to hear your
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's a good ethical basis for prioritizing children with deceased donor organ transplants. The other thing that we observe, it's not always true, but younger people are much more likely to have living donors. Basically, sadly, the older you are, the less likely you are to have a living donor. But the good news for children is that, a large proportion of children have a living donor, and those who don't, they get a lot of priority on the waiting list. So I hope to live in a world where that, most kids or all kids can get a transplant with a short waiting time. And I have a feeling for the, in the early stages of xenotransplant, it probably will be adults with few other good options. The other thing I was just going to mention, I really appreciate that someone asked about UNOS. So it turns out if you read UNOS's charter, doesn't include oversight of xeno organs, only includes oversight of human organs. And so, if xenotransplant becomes, more part of common practice, they may have to rewrite the regulations around UNOS, because there will be things like who's a qualified professional to take care of one of these patients, what does informed consent need to look like, that eventually will need to get regulated. And a body like UNOS would be a good body, or some parallel one, to take on those tasks. I don't think it's needed now, but it will be.
Thank you. Have you sampled the views of the public on xenotransplantation?
I guess I'll take the first time at it. So lot of groups, both within US and even internationally, have sampled public perceptions, public views of xenotransplantation. Most of them have been in form of questionnaires being administered, and interesting information that we find from some of those is the medical community overestimates the risk aversion of the patients than the patients actually do. So what that means is a physician or a medical provider is more likely to say a patient will never accept that. But when patients are sampled, they are not all patients fall in that bucket. So that's the idea of us overestimating. Beyond just sampling patients through questionnaires, there's a few groups that have actually done focus groups where they've sat down and talked to patients, and many professional organizations have partnered in that. Heather, this might be a good time for you to talk about what you led through the NKF efforts of the externally led patient-focused drug development, and then would love to hear Dr. Kawai and Dr. Reese. Dr. Reese partnered in that too. Yeah.
I have
Absolutely.
nothing to add. So you did it.
So, as Dr. Kumar mentioned, we held what's called an externally led patient-focused drug development meeting this past November. And what this meeting is intended to do is to bring patients together, and we invite the FDA, the public, xenotransplant companies, and any interested people to hear from these patients. The patients then get to describe what it's like living with kidney disease and the currently available treatments, and then what they think about xenotransplantation in that context. So, for example, somebody that has just received a kidney from a living donor, an allotransplant, might have a different perspective on xenotransplantation and of the risks and what they might be willing to take, compared to somebody that is on dialysis and might not be eligible for an allotransplant. And it's important to look at the differences in the patient perspectives. And what we really saw from that meeting was that patients are interested in seeing this move forward, and they want to know if this is a safe and effective option to treat kidney failure, because there is not enough kidneys to go around, and dialysis isn't necessarily an equal alternative. And I think that sums it up in a very concise manner, but is there anything else, Dr. Reese or Dr. Kwai, you'd want to add to that?
No. Go ahead.
Thank you. We know that the public and the patients have a lot to say about what they want in their care. And so we plan to continue surveying this and working with the community and the patients as this advances. So we are getting very close to the end. I want to just ask the experts, is there anything that you're seeing that you would like to answer or address? There's a lot of questions about the timeline.
Yeah, I think we really want to hear the patient voice, and the reason we decided to go ahead for the first human kidney transplantation is after attending the NKF meeting that after hearing the patient voices, so that can move us and move FDA. So that's very important. So just speak up and please let us know your voice.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I really appreciate that the National Kidney Foundation has invested a lot of time and attention in this. And organizations like NKF are just a really great way for patients' voices to kind of be bundled together and louder. So, and this is not the only patient organization, but I think where you're able to support these patient-facing organizations, I think they'll be the ones that are alert to opportunities. Write a letter to the FDA and make this point. Things like that, I think, will be just really important. They get tired of hearing from experts. They want to hear from patients.
Absolutely, 100% agree with that. Heather, I'm seeing a question here that says, have you found through the transplants done that the kidneys over-filtered or under-filtered other important nutrients and toxins? It's a very, very important question. We are putting a pig kidney into a human, albeit it's a modified pig kidney into a human. There's a lot of similarities between pig and human kidneys. So for the most part, the pig kidneys are able to do some of the general functions that human kidneys do, cleaning toxins, maintaining blood pressure. However, there are also some fundamental differences between pig and human kidneys. We know from decedent experiments that we'll have to watch the recipients closely. Would love to hear from Dr. Kawai if when the first in-human pig kidney was done, what did you see in terms of physiology?
That is the area to investigate. It's for example, it's a bit difficult to make a fluid balance. So how to use the diuretics is a little bit different. So we have to monitor calcium phosphate balance is a bit different. So those are nephrologists needs to work a lot, not surgeon, but
in general, it looks like things like BUN and creatinine, the waste products, potassium, it should be able to handle it okay. Salt and fluid balance and phosphorus, getting rid of phosphorus, those might be things that we may need to be more careful and maybe even have to still use phosphate binders after transplant. These patients we know will require continued, in this iteration, erythropoietin or darbepoetin, the anemia agents that help treat anemia that kidney disease patients have. So there are some fundamental differences. The good part of it is we think we know what we need to anticipate to take care of patients afterwards. But as we do more, we'll learn more.
Thank you so much. And now we're at the end of our hour. So thank you so much, Dr. Reese, Dr. Kawai, and Dr. Kumar, and everybody that has joined the webinar. I hope that your questions were answered, and if they were not, Please join our mailing list. Please email me directly. And I will be sending a follow-up email with some links to the National Kidney Foundation resources that we have. Otherwise, I hope that you have a great day. Thank you, everyone, for your time.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.